Welcome to Brainwaves Bistro. Grab yourselves a cuppa, kick back, and join us for mental health talk with a positive vibe. Here's Julianne.
It is my absolute privilege to welcome back neurosurgeon and best-selling New York Times author Dr. Eben Alexander, along with Karen Newell, who he says is more than his muse. She is everything to him. And we'll talk about that later. Both have written Living in a Mindful Universe, a neurosurgeon's journey into the heart of consciousness. And it, as Eben says, is a synthesis of both science and spirituality. Now, Proof of Heaven was Eben's first book, Journey into the Afterlife, and it's not only thought-provoking, but gives us a gift of hope, comfort, and love. It led Eben to be lauded as one of the top 100 spiritual influences of our time, along with the Dalai Lama, Pope Francis, and Oprah. Indeed, Eben, you have been interviewed by the likes of Oprah, and not only that, you have been acclaimed by so many, and this is very important, in our science and medical community. And Karen, you have followed a lifetime of your own spiritual journey, studying ancient cultures such as the Egyptians, the Indian gurus, even the works of Plato. And I hear you've got some fondness of our Australian didgeridoo, which is, and the Aborigines are actually the oldest living continuous civilization. Yes, a journey incorporating the study of acoustics, Karen, sound and vibrations to access deeper states of knowing within ourselves. Welcome, Eben. Welcome, Karen. Again, such a privilege to have you talking us today. And a girl with herself a big heart, a lovely co-host, Barb Smith. Hi, Eben and Karen.
Hello, Julianne. Thank you so much for having us on today.
Hello, this is going to be fun.
We always have fun, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I am so excited to hear more about what your journeys have been about. Eben, please tell us your amazing journey, how it started with your near-death experience, and then please tell us how Karen and you met.
Well, I think I want to be very brief about my experience because it's a long, big story, and people, of course, can read Proof of Heaven and the many YouTube videos. But I think the important things to point out as a neurosurgeon who had spent his life studying brain, mind, and phenomenal consciousness, it was very instructive. It had to do with the fact that the disease I had, a severe case of E. coli bacterial meningitis, basically disabled the neocortex of my brain stem. Any of the parts of the brain that might have been devoted to a dream or hallucination were shut down. That's why the medical community takes my story so seriously. An important part of the story that's very different from other NDEs, but I realize now that it really was an important ingredient for me to fully understand my NDE, in a deep way, was that I was amnesic. I didn't have any memories of Eben Alexander's life, of humans, of Earth, our language. Every bit of that was gone from me. It was an empty slate. But it was crucial to go that deep for me to really come away from it believing in the reality of the experience. And I only recognized all of that in the months and years after the coma. The journey involved several levels, starting in the Earthworm Eye View, primitive course unresponsive realm, but then up through this musical portal of light into this brilliant, ultra-real Gateway Valley, much more real than this world. Many Earth-like features. I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing, but also many spiritual features. I had a spiritual guide, a young woman who accompanied me, who ended up being crucial to understanding the reality of the situation when I received a picture in the mail 4 months after my coma. But that's a whole big, long story that's there for anybody who wants to read Proof of Heaven to learn more. In that setting, I also ascended to higher and higher levels where all of four-dimensional space-time collapsed down, all of the deep spiritual realm, plus that completely different ordering of time that I call meta time or deep time collapsing down, and then pure oneness with the core, where I recognize that our very conscious awareness is sourced in that God force of pure love. Multiple passes through all these different levels that led to a lot of learning and lessons. And then towards the end, I was no longer allowed to simply manifest this portal up into the beautiful core realm, but in fact found that I could no longer get there, which they told me many a time. I wasn't there to stay. That's when I saw the 6 faces that would bubble up out of the muck. And the 6 faces were very important to help me peg when the events happened of the coma and the deep spiritual experience. Anyway, at the end of it all, the last of those 6 faces was a 10-year-old boy. I didn't recognize at the time. My amnesia was still very active, but it was my son, Bond. And the doctors had held a family conference where they said I'd gone from 10% chance of survival early in the week down to 2% chance of survival on day 7, a Sunday morning. And that's where they said it was time to take me off the ventilator and just let me die. And Bond came running down the hallway when he heard that. They protected him from the worst news, pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. I didn't see him with my eyes, hear him with my ears, didn't understand those words, didn't know who he was. But that beautiful sense of connection with him, I knew I had to come back to this world. So that's exactly what happened. It took me 2 months to have a full return of function after that. And I've spent 15 years since that time working with scientists around the world, other investigators, coming to a deeper understanding of the nature of consciousness. But most importantly, during those 15 years is 11 years ago, I met Karen Newell and found she had been living her whole life as an idealist. I was just beginning to realize that idealism was the most appropriate model for assessing the world in a modern scientific philosophical way. And Karen had been doing it her whole life. So Karen, thank you for clarifying so many things to me and coming into my life. And of course, she also is co-developer of sacred acoustics, meditation, etc. So there's a whole bigger role for her for the general public.
Well, when we first met, I just want to tell that story. When we first met, we were both attending a workshop that involved using sound to get into expanded states of consciousness. I had already been attending these types of workshops for several years, and Eben had just started. He had learned about this possibility after he had his coma. So this was 3 years after his coma, but before he even had an agent or a publisher for his story. He met his agent 1 week after we met, interestingly enough. But the week that we met, we were spending a week together at this retreat. And right away, Eben was paying attention to me. And we had this kind of connection that we couldn't really put words to, but we were having conversation. And I knew that he had had a near-death experience. I had just learned that about him, but I didn't know anything about it. Now, I had known others who had had near-death experiences, and I knew that they always came away from these experiences learning some usually very deeply profound personal spiritual lesson, often about love and connection and things like that. So I just wanted to know about that. I said, well, I didn't want to know what happened. I said, what did you learn? What was the biggest lesson you learned? And he looks at me and he says, the brain doesn't create consciousness. And I said, I was confused. And I said, well, why would anyone think that it does? Because to me, that idea made absolutely no sense. Little did I know that this concept, this assumption is really kind of the center, the fulcrum of scientific materialist thought, that all of consciousness, all of our hopes, dreams, emotions, and feelings, all of that is some kind of illusion that is produced by the brain, that the brain is fundamental and kind of makes us think that we're having this experience, but it's all just tricking us. That's what materialist scientists believe. That's what Eben believed before he went into his coma. And now he realized, oh my gosh, now that his awareness was having such a rich, vivid experience completely separate from his physical body, he knew now that consciousness was much, much more than he realized. But I already had known that just from doing my own personal discoveries and spiritual exploration. I had taken many, many courses in many, many different modalities like Reiki, remote viewing, feng shui, healing touch for animals, all kinds of things. I wanted to learn more about this non-physical part of myself. We can call it our soul, our essence, that part of us that survives the death of the physical body. And this understanding I already had. What's so interesting is that many of us lay people, we already have this understanding. We already understand that there's more to our world than just the physical. And yet so many science-minded, rational thinking type of people want to deny the existence of a soul. In fact, if I even bring up that there's evidence for an eternal soul, some of my kind of more rational friends, they kind of recoil and they're like, oh my God, how could you think that? And they think I'm suddenly turning religious. But this is a spirituality that doesn't require religion. Religion can be involved, but this is not about religion. This is about acknowledging that we are spiritual beings, that we are fundamentally our consciousness, our awareness, and getting to know more about that. That is what can really help our lives and our physical reality change by focusing on our inner world somehow. This seems to have a rather profound effect on our outer world. That's what idealism is, if anyone didn't realize. When Eben says he's moving towards this idea of, or has moved towards this idea of idealism, that puts us as humans directly empowered to really understand that what we do in our inner worlds is affecting what's going on out in the world. And so when we look around the world at large these days, we see a lot of trouble. It's not easy to see that there's a lot of things going wrong. And what this philosophy would explain that as is we got a little trouble in our inner worlds going on, anxieties, fears, and so on. And if we can clear all of that, that will make a difference in the outer world. That's what idealism is, the complete opposite of materialism. It puts consciousness at our awareness at the very center of everything. And that should be empowering and good news to all of us.
Oh, that's very, and also I just wanted to ask, clarify this. Memory. Science cannot prove that memory resides in the material brain. That backs up your point, huh?
That's actually a point that we deliver quite a bit of discussion of in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, in an appendix and also in the main text. And it really, neurosurgeons have kind of suspected that for a very long time, because in spite of more than a century of resecting brains in patients around the world, there's never been one case where a brain resection led to any deletion of long-term memories. It just doesn't happen. It's known that if you operate on the medial temporal lobes, the hippocampus, that area, that yes, you can cause great trouble in how somebody converts short-term to long-term memories, but that's not the same thing as finding where long-term memories are stored. And in fact, given that big analysis, depending in our book, and a lot of it depends on the work of Wilder Penfield and other observations, you come to realize memory is not stored in the brain, but it's one of the biggest nails in the coffin of materialist neuroscience that we're only just beginning to really discuss that seriously. But then, it becomes a question of a much deeper questioning of this whole reality that we're witnessing. And that's really where, these experiences demand that we take a much deeper look at what's going on, and to explain near-death experiences and related shared death experiences where normal, healthy people can go through the process of a near-death experience with someone who's dying and then come back to this world. Those are things that we really have no way explaining in our materialist science. And yet this new expanded quantum-informed science of consciousness, which is right at the heart of everything we say in Living in a Mindful Universe, that is a way forward where you can start make sense of all this. But it ends up that sensible response notes that consciousness is primordial and that the physical world emerges from the realm of mind. And it's really that connected kind of God mind that, is at the center of explaining all this and understanding it. But it also has a lot to do with, for example, quantum physics and quantum indeterminacy, which is where our free will comes in loud and clear, because materialism, as I worshiped it before my coma, and I do not use that term lightly, but that same materialist neuroscientific thought would scoff at you if you claim to have free will. So to them, it's all chemical reactions in the brain, electron fluxes. They give us an illusion of free will, an illusion of perception and of consciousness. But they claim that it's a fully deterministic system. Quantum physics totally changes that and completely opens the door to true free will in the universe and an unfolding future that reflects our interaction with it as sentient beings. And that is what is so important, because in fact that materialism is a bleak and paltry fiction, pretending that it's birth to death and nothing more, that we don't have free will, that we're these physical bodies that are basically meat robots. They've really missed the target dramatically. And that's why near-death experiences and many other of the various features that contribute to the modern understanding of consciousness are really pointing to this world of idealism or primacy of mind. And when you recognize how all that mind seems to be interconnected, that's where we start saying, well, just to use the word idealism doesn't really cover what's going on. The connectedness of mind, the deep power of that kind of spiritual force in us, and that the obvious presence of a loving force at the core of the universe, which is what gives near-death experiencers so much comfort when they take these deep dives into those realms and then come back to this world, recognizing that their existence as a soul is not dependent on the brain and body existing. But in many ways is independent of that. And that's a real gift to understand for humans, especially with a lot of the ego toxicity of our modern culture, which means fear of death, because ego injects right in there, along with other problems like addictions and what have you. Yes. But fear of death can be a huge kind of, fear that controls our lives. And that's an ego fear. And once we start to develop our sense as a higher soul, moving beyond the ego, which is something I've been able to do tremendously through meditation using sacred acoustics that Karen has gifted the world with. She and her partner, Kevin Cossie, beginning 11 years ago. That sacred acoustics I've used on a daily basis, an hour or two a day, sometimes more if I have the time, to meditate, going within. And that's where all of us can discover we're much more than that little ego voice. In fact, the first step when I do meditation is to let my ego voice make a request, ask a question, but then it goes into timeout, because I've learned to ride those sacred acoustics tones and really use meditation to cross that veil and get into much deeper touch with that primordial mind of the universe.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, I am not a good meditator, but I'm very, very keen to learn more and develop the abilities that you say we all have to a higher level. And we can tune into sacredacoustics.com, Karen, and learn more about it. I really want to know, Karen, how sound and vibration, how you portray that as a healing power and part of your journey to spirituality.
Yeah, well, sound has been used, as we were discussing before the podcast, for more than 40,000 years. It goes all the way back to the Aboriginals who used mainly the didgeridoo. And I'm fascinated by the didgeridoo. In fact, one of our recordings, just as an aside, Know Yourself, we include a didgeridoo in that recording. Some people can't handle it for long periods of time, but it's really good for certain situations. But at any rate, there's all kinds of sound healing out in the world. It's really making an explosion. People have heard of like gong baths, sound baths, which I would attend, and you just feel all these vibrations of gongs, crystal bowls, brass bowls, and that it can be quite powerful. It's sort of shifting your system into one that is more receptive to healing. But the kind of sound that we create is known as binaural beats. And this is when you put one frequency in one ear, a slightly different frequency in the other ear, and it creates this wavering sound, this wah, wah, wah sound, this kind of regular sound. And Eben would say that it's monotonizing the lower brainstem, which is the most primitive part of our consciousness. So what it does is it bypasses the linguistic brain of the neocortex, the human part of our brain that is the outermost surface of our brain. And so what we're getting to is that primitive part so we can really escape the here and now. So these binaural beats, they're targeted to different brain wave states. And so when people have heard these terms, delta is associated with sleep. When you measure the electric signal coming out of the brain with an EEG, you find that 0 to 4 hertz, the lowest part of the range, is associated with sleep. The brain becomes a little bit more active, 4 to 7 hertz, in the theta state. That's associated with meditation or the space between awake and asleep. Now, alpha is just up from that, 7 to 12 hertz. That's associated with focused states of awareness. So if you're very focused reading or, calculating numbers or something like that, you might be in an alpha state. The beta state is 12 to 30 hertz. That's the state we're in when we're walking, we're talking, we're thinking, our brains are, going on and on with those incessant thoughts. That's the beta state. So when we feed these signals to the brain, it actually brings the brain into these lower states associated with delta and theta and alpha. Mostly we target that space between awake and asleep, right around 4 hertz. If you go to our website, you'll find a free 20-minute recording. It's our Om recording, but it contains high, I think it's 3.875 or something, very high delta. This puts you in a state where your body is profoundly relaxed, but your mind is still aware. And so for anyone who's having trouble with meditation, which has all kinds of healing benefits on its own, if you're having trouble with that, like I did, these types of sounds can help you. I think of them as training wheels. They can help you get into these states more easily, recognize these states. They can often be quite subtle. It helps to reduce that incessant chatter that many of us have in our brains. I would say all of us have these thoughts coming at us all the time. That's not our consciousness. Those are just our thoughts. And that's the ego. Those are ego driven, really driven by your personality, not necessarily your higher soul. Your higher soul is much more neutral. And when you can get behind all of those incessant thoughts, you find what we call the inner observer. And that's where you start to get a bigger, sort of broader perspective on what's going on, where when you can get into these types of expanded states, you're less emotionally reactive. You're more able to focus on, clearly the different types of goals you might have. You can work on modifying non-beneficial belief systems, maybe. I used to have a belief that I couldn't meditate. I heard you say that. Oh, I can't meditate. That's what I used to say to myself. And here I was trying to learn to meditate. And I thought, how is this helping me? So I changed my inner self-talk. And every time I would say, oh gosh, I can't meditate, I would switch it and say, yes, you can meditate. And so that was one step. But when I had struggles with meditation, it was sound that really helped. And at first it was things like crystal bowls, brass bowls, like I discussed a moment ago. Those instruments are actually emanating natural binaural beats. They have that same type of sound, wah, wah, that it's the sound kind of bouncing against the walls of these bowls and gongs that kind of creates these sounds, this vibrational sound. So those crystal brass bowls are helping to get you into an expanded state in a similar way. The difference is that our recordings are incredibly precise. They're done with very complex mathematical formulas. Music is math. And so we use that to our advantage because our audio engineer, Kevin Cossey, who is the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics, he's an engineer. And so he gets out these giant spreadsheets and figures out all the different brainwaves we want to deliver. He figures out which carrier tones will work best, and he makes them all harmonic to any other frequency that's in the recording. And so in this way, we're able to reduce the use of white noise, rain sound, surf sound. Many binaural beats that people listen to will have these types of sounds like pink noise, something like that to help soften the digital frequencies. But when we create them using these harmonic principles, that becomes less necessary. So wide range of potential effects that people can have, starting from just feeling more relaxed or getting some better sleep, all the way to getting into states where you might connect with the souls of departed loved ones, or meet up with spirit guides, or have out-of-body experiences. There's just a really wide range of different, I'll say, spiritual adventures that people can get into. And none of it will happen without your participation. So anyone who might be concerned about, I don't want to have an out-of-body experience, or, oh my gosh, what is an out-of-body experience? Don't worry about that. Those things don't just happen to you. Very often you're involved with creating those types of experience using different mental exercises. So all of this is to say that anyone who wants to find out should just go get some headphones, very important, so you get the left and right signal. Listen to the samples on our website and find out for yourself. One very specific healing aspect that I'll mention here is mental health. We actually did a pilot study where we found, using a particular set of recordings, those recordings on our website are known as the Whole Mind Bundle, available to anyone. They were used in a pilot study that showed over a 2-week period of listening, a 26%.
I noticed that, Karen, yeah.
26% reduction in anxiety, and the control group was only 7%. Those were people just getting regular psychiatric therapy without the sound. But I know your sponsor is a wonderful mental health organization. So anyone who takes time to do this, is it BlackRock? Is that the right?
Black Dog Institute.
Black Dog. I love dogs. I should.
We're their sponsor.
You're their sponsor.
Well, I'm joking, but in the sense that we try and make people aware, as you do, about the good things you do, about mental health research.
Anyone who is taking time to do that is helping all of us. That's what
right. Exactly.
Yeah, anyone who reduces their own anxiety, you're helping yourself and the world.
Well, we've got to remember too that anxiety and depression are the largest, or the biggest mental disorders. And from there you get comorbidity of other disorders. So if we can find something like your sacred acoustics to incorporate that in, and we do a little bit of kind of mindfulness to incorporate that, we can really have an impact on mental health worldwide. So
yeah, and just so you know, these recordings, the pilot study came out in February of 2020, 1 month before the COVID worldwide pandemic began. And so my gift to the world at that point, like everyone was trying to figure out how they could help, was to make these recordings available at no cost. I reduced the cost significantly, but also so many people were in financial distress. That's not a barrier anymore. And so there are many mental health professionals who actually prescribe these recordings. There's an addiction doctor who does. Lots of people are taking advantage of the opportunity, but we're all different. So we're not all going to respond the same way. I got to make sure to say that. Yeah. But it's definitely worth trying. It takes some trial and error to find what works best for each of us.
I think a beautiful example you might share has to do with people working with suicide children.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, just share that.
2 different acupuncturists here in the United States. One was in Colorado, one was upper Midwest, Illinois or Indiana or something. And they were both working with teenagers who had attempted suicide but had failed. So they were still with us getting therapy.
Yeah.
And they would play music while they did their acupuncture sessions. And both of them started using sacred acoustics recordings. And when they did that, these teenagers started saying things like, oh my gosh, I feel this connection to the universe. If I had felt that before, I never would have tried to take my own life. And so they wanted me to know what a difference it was making. And so many, many ways for people to use them. We encourage combinations of modalities to, increase their power. So
that's very, very exciting. And what I decided to do in a split second is to make sure that the research team and at Black Dog hears our interview, because they're researching all the time. So let's just add another if they haven't already.
Wonderful. And I'd be happy to provide, just as before, any recordings for research purposes. So.
That's wonderful. Yes.
Yeah, no problem.
And of course, we'd be happy to collaborate with any researchers to the extent that they'd like to collaborate in terms of designing studies and really putting this to work. So
that's wonderful. See, a lot of the work Black Dog does is in suicide prevention. And they've written white papers for the government. And what we're looking to when we talk about the Indigenous, in Australia, they have 3 times the suicide rate. I think it might be similar to in the US with statistics with the Indigenous, and also the LGBTQI community, 3 times the rate. So we're working on that. In fact, where I live, which is kind of a nice area like where you live, our suicide rate is incredibly high, above the average. So there's so much work we have to do to try and improve the quality of people's lives. And what you're doing is fantastic, to combining all your experience and then with Sacred Acoustics to work to help people. So thank you.
Well, one of the things I'd like to mention in terms of mental health is that, we're all used to worrying about our physical health, and now mental health is becoming much more easy to talk about and get treatment for and so on. But there's also spiritual health. And many people think that your spiritual life means you're religious. But to us, spiritual health is a sense of connection to something greater than yourself. And so I'm thinking of the LGBTQI community who, is kind of in many cases ostracized from the greater community. Feeling that connection can make so much difference. Having a sense of meaning to your daily life and an overriding sense of purpose of why you're even going through all of this. So if people can find connection, meaning, and purpose in their lives, this sometimes is what drives those mental health symptoms. And society at large isn't quite there yet with acknowledging the power of spiritual health, especially in mental health, but including physical health. Kelly Turner wrote a book called Radical Remission. She studied all of these cancer remission cases, and she found that there were 9 factors involved with people who had these spontaneous remissions. 6 of them were spiritual, that had to do with connection, meaning, purpose, all of that. So it can help with your physical health as well. Bringing attention to spiritual health, again, does not involve religion. And this is something that I think society at large can begin to start to integrate so that we can see even better improvements.
That's just amazing. I mean, my co-host here, I'm going to mention her, and she's going to talk a little bit at the end, is a stage 4 cancer survivor. Mm-hmm. And she is, can I say this, Barb, very spiritual. So I think a lot of that helped her to survive with her own grit, determination, and change in her lifestyle. So, yes, what you've just said is very, very relevant, and thank you. What I'm going to say now is this has been a wonderful discussion. And, to find the meaning and purpose in life, you've found liberation, better quality of living and decision-making. And I want to thank you so, so much for both joining us. And now I'm going to ask you, Barb, to come on. We've talked about our amazing brain and our soulful universe that gives us a collective conscious of one. And Barb, I'm going to thank you guys very, very much and leave it to Barb. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Karen, so much.
Well, thank you, Julianne, for having us on. It's great being with you. And Bob, great meeting you too.
Yes, and so wonderful to connect with like-minded souls, even from the other side of the globe.
Right.
Wonderful.
That's so good. Thanks, Julianne, and also Evan and Karen. So just some science, compassion and action, talking about Black Dog Institute. Their statistics are 1 in 5 will experience symptoms of mental illness in any given year. And in Australia, that's around 5 million people. And roughly 60% of those people don't seek help. As the only medical research institute in Australia to investigate mental health across our lifespan, their aim is to create a mentally healthier world for everyone. And they do this through translational research, integrating their research, studies, education programs, digital tools and apps, clinical services and public resources to discover new solutions, foster connections and create real-world change, which is what you were talking about earlier. The partnerships with people with lived experience, federal, state and local governments and communities, schools, corporate Australia and others in the mental health sector enables them to drive evidence-informed change in mental health where it's needed most. So as Julianne often says to me, no donation is too small. So please Google Black Dog Institute. And to wrap up, I'd like to thank Karen and Evan for being on Brainwaves Bistro and for Julianne for hosting and providing this wonderful episode. And so have a great day and a great one tomorrow.